Molt bé, doncs faig un punt de situació respecte a la sessió d'avui perquè estiguem tots contextualitzats. Aquesta és una sessió que forma part del taller internacional d'aquest grup de treball sobre competències per a la sostenibilitat que estem duent a terme Catesco i la Universitat Pompeu Fabra, amb l'objectiu de poder veure d'alguna manera com podem avaluar aquestes competències per a la sostenibilitat que defineix la UNESCO en aquest Educació per als ODS, objectius d'aprenentatge, doncs poder aterrar en el dia a dia de l'aula, en el dia a dia de les escoles, com es desenvolupen aquestes competències en els nostres aprenents, en els nostres alumnes i d'alguna manera com ho podem saber que això s'està desenvolupant. Per tant, hi ha una tasca aquí de desgranar bé quins són els elements claus d'aquestes competències per a la sostenibilitat que defineix la UNESCO i després definir aquestes eines útils que siguin pràctiques en el seu dia a dia i que serveixin sobretot per a l'aprenentatge, és a dir, per al desenvolupament d'aquestes competències en els aprenents i per al guiatge o el seguiment que puguem fer com a docents. Com sabeu, aquest grup de treball, per poder elaborar tot això, va voler comptar amb aportacions o amb intercanvis amb experts d'abast internacional i avui comptem amb aquesta tercera aportació, que és la doctora, la professora Felisa Tibbitts. En una primera sessió vam comptar amb el doctor Gregorio Rodríguez, amb qui vam desenvolupar o vam analitzar diverses tipologies o enfocaments de l'avaluació i com d'alguna manera aquesta avaluació competencial s'havia de transformar en una eina realment eficaç per a l'aprenentatge. Després també vam treballar amb el doctor Riekman sobre la definició d'aquestes competències per a la sostenibilitat de la UNESCO. Ell és l'autor principal del llibre Educar per als ODS i, per tant, ens permetia conèixer més a fons aquestes competències i no només això, sinó que també treballar tots els aspectes d'aquesta educació per als ODS com una palanca per convertir els aprenents, per fer que els nostres aprenents esdevinguin aquests agents de canvi, que prenguin aquesta consciència per la transformació social, que és una mica el que estem buscant tots plegats aquí. Finalment, avui tenim l'honor i el plaer de comptar amb la professora, amb la doctora Felisa Tibbitts. Ella és catedràtica d'Educació en Drets Humans a la Universitat d'Utrecht. Té una càtedra UNESCO en Drets Humans i Educació Superior i, per tant, ens permet vincular molt bé tot el món d'aquesta UNESCO que també hem estat treballant en aquest grup de treball, però a més és professora també a la Universitat de Colúmbia i col·labora amb moltes altres universitats, des de Harvard fins a la Nelson Mandela University de Sud-àfrica. La seva recerca inclou molts àmbits que ens connecten a tots plegats i que jo crec que ens poden ser de molt d'interès, des d'educació democràtica i per als drets humans, tot el treball al voltant de la construcció de ciutadania global i com això connecta amb l'educació per la pau. I, per tant, hi ha molts elements aquí de conceptes com la justícia global, que també utilitzem aquí, que d'alguna manera ens poden permetre donar sentit, posar un context en aquest treball que estem fent en aquest grup. Ens interessa el seu doble rol perquè ella té molta experiència i molt coneixement, ja ho veureu, també ens ajudarà una mica a posar significat i llenguatge en aquests grans conceptes, però té molta experiència en aquests aspectes de justícia global, de pau, de democràcia, però també en com l'educació esdevé una palanca de canvi per això. I per això ens interessava aquesta doble vessant seva que creiem que ens pot aportar molt. Com sempre, animar-vos a que participeu al màxim, a que l'aprofitem al màxim, aquestes 2 hores i amb ella i l'oportunitat que tenim de comptar amb ella. Ella ha preparat una sessió, en aquest sentit, participativa, perquè es dedica a això, per tant, coherent amb la seva ideologia i amb la seva manera de pensar i de treballar. I, per tant, esperem que pugueu participar i prendre part d'aquesta conversa perquè ens sigui molt profitosa per la feina que estem fent al grup de treball. I en qualsevol cas, benvinguts i benvingudes tots. I li passo la paraula a la Felisa. Felisa, moltes gràcies per estar aquí amb nosaltres i som teus.
Marina, thank you so much for inviting me to join this group. I think it's fantastic that you have a working group comprised of practicing teachers to address these very essential questions about competencies and assessments that many, many teachers are interested in for ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, as well as intergovernmental agencies and higher education institutions. So hello, everybody, and thank you for welcoming me into your group and for tolerating my working in English. My apologies that I do need to work in my own mother tongue and that it's different than yours. I have indeed prepared some activities, some discussion points, some slides, some resources to share with you. But I also understand that this should be a kind of conversation that we have. So please do feel free to write questions in the chat box that you would like to ask me or raise your hand. I'm happy to take questions as I proceed. I probably have much more to share with you than we have time for, so we'll just have to see how it goes. But if you don't mind, what I'm going to go ahead and do now is share my plan for today. I am, yes, one of those instructors who's really used to teaching on Zoom now, so it wasn't difficult to think of apps we could use. So I decided in today's session, since it's really short, it's going to fly by, to focus on two different approaches inside of a wider frame of global justice. The first being global citizenship education, which of course is very highly placed in relation to education for sustainable development in the SDGs and UNESCO's world. In conjunction with GCE, Global Citizenship Education, I want to work with you a little bit on curriculum strategies and measurement, because I know those are interests of your group. I'm also going to address human rights education, doing a little bit of background, very light background on what are human rights, and use that topic to get into critical pedagogy and methodologies. I am not, familiar with all that you addressed in your last two sessions, but this is the way I've planned to organize ourselves today, and I hope that it's okay with you. I'd like to begin with a Mentimeter poll. I'm going to share that information with you shortly. I hope you've had an opportunity to use such an app before. I have 3 questions in this poll, and I'm going to ask you to indicate how much you agree with these statements about education. And let me go to the Mentimeter. Let me see, let's see, I think it's here. Sorry, here we go. So the way that I like to do this with my students is that I basically go to present. I suggest you go to www.mentimeter.com and you insert this code, and you will then see what we're all seeing here. It's in English, so I would like to I'd like to give you a moment to get to menti.com and then request that the interpreters read the statements in Catalan. I'll read them out loud myself while you're getting there. So again, I'm looking for your degree of agreement or disagreement. The first statement is, education should prepare learners to be competitive in global job markets. You can indicate your degree of agreement with that. The second statement, education should prepare learners to live in multicultural and diverse societies. And the third statement, education should prepare learners to have a critical consciousness and improve society. I'll give us just 30 more seconds and then we'll debrief. I don't see anyone else posting, so obviously we can see very clearly that there is strong support amongst those of you who completed this poll for the idea that education should prepare learners to live in multicultural and diverse societies. And if you could mute yourself if you're not speaking, maybe I can ask the organizers to mute participants. Yeah, great, because I don't think I'm able to do so. Of course, and then to have a critical consciousness and improvement in society, also strong support. More than half of you feeling agreement, certainly more agreement than disagreement, that education should prepare learners to be competitive in global markets. And perhaps it's not surprising that that wasn't as strongly represented amongst you all, given the group and the topic for today. I asked you these questions because they actually coincide with different perspectives that we can find related to global citizenship education. So the first perspective, which all has to do with the purposes of schooling, and obviously schooling serves multiple purposes. But this idea that schools should prepare students to be globally competitive is very, very strongly, I think, embraced by many ministries of education. And frankly, if I was a minister of education, I would also feel that one of the first things I needed to be doing was to be ensuring that my students could get jobs. But of course, the discussion and the tension around that purpose of schooling comes out when we have to actually develop national curriculum frameworks, or we as teachers have to respond to curriculum guidelines in meeting assessments that our students are required to do well on. So the diversity, the education for diversity and multiculturalism is associated with what's called the Cosmopolitan approach to global citizenship education. And this idea that education should raise critical consciousness and orient students towards a role in promoting social justice, which is really the theme of today's webinar, is associated with an advocacy approach for global citizenship education. So I'm going to move now into UNESCO's humanistic view on global citizenship education, but wanted you to know that there are different rationales for global citizenship education, and they often coexist within schooling systems. The question is what degree of emphasis each of them gets. Globalization, of course, is the background for global citizenship education. And perhaps I just wanted to take a moment to share with you a definition I like, which is globalization, broadly defined as a process of increasing interdependence between people, territories, and organizations. So it's not only between people, but also between nation states, between civil society organizations. Intergovernmental organizations like UNESCO also are reflections of globalization, but in very different domains. It's economic for sure, political, cultural, and we might even add, right, environmental, interconnections between geography and environmentalism and communication. So we can actually add much more to this list of interdependence. And now during the pandemic period, of course, our interdependence, our mutual interdependence has come out so strongly. And so globalization, right? This is the reality that we live in, and global citizenship education has received increasing emphasis because of this wider feature of what's happening globally. I think I'm going to skip some slides so that we can be sure to have enough conversation, and it's already 20 minutes after the hour. UNESCO has a very well-developed approach to global citizenship education, and I'm very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to work with them since 2015, actually, on some of their policy documents and their resources, one of which I'll be sharing with you a bit later. UNESCO, like other UN agencies, has embraced, the value system of the United Nations, which means that, the ethos of the United Nations that they promote with member states and with educators is the role of education for promoting peace, human rights, equality, tolerance of diversity, although I would rephrase that to really celebration of diversity, and sustainable development. So this is very, very traditional, if you will, for UNESCO. And in language that they have in their first kind of classic document on global citizenship education, which came out in 2014, they have had subsequently many more resources and policy guidelines come out. But this one in 2014 was kind of the launch of UNESCO's engagement with global citizenship education vis-a-vis the mandate from the Secretary General's office. And here we see their language in the second paragraph. In an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world, we're of course relating to globalization, there's a need for transformative pedagogy. Very powerful words that enables learners to resolve persistent challenges related to sustainable development and peace that concerns all humanity. These include all forms of inequality and injustice. I hope and expect that in your previous conversations with education for sustainable development, you've also already been discussing amongst yourselves the ways in which unequal access to resources or unequal levels of vulnerability related to climate change are, evident on our planet. And probably also you've been thinking about those challenges in regards to how one educates for education for sustainable development and engage young people. Likewise, global citizenship education and human rights education, the two that I'll be focusing on today, are very much oriented, of course, to this notion of justice and vulnerability and education's role in highlighting those inequalities, what we need to be paying attention to, and how what happens in schools through transformative pedagogy, which we will get into, can help to activate learners to do something positive in at whatever level they can do so, whether it's in their schools or their communities or something wider. You probably know that UNESCO believes that education is a human right for all throughout life. So the language of human rights itself is embedded in the idea of lifelong learning, the globals and the sustainable development goals, which Marina tells me you're familiar with, of course, has succeeded the Millennium Development Goals and has, in the area of 4.0 of the Sustainable Development Goals, identified the right to education, basic education, pushing that now into secondary school levels. And my anticipation is also in the future into higher education as well. So it's a human right for all throughout life, both in the formal and non-formal sector, but it also calls for a quality education. So what we don't see in this language here, but what I want to mention because it's relevant for our conversation today, is UNESCO's belief through the human rights-based approach that all of us should have access to education, but to quality education. So although it's been amazing progress in the last 20 years for many children and youth to have access to a school that may not have been in their community before, and to have access in mother tongue instruction, perhaps that also wasn't something that happened before. But quality education also reflects access to education about the values, let's say, that the UN stands for. Access to education that promotes inclusion and diversity, knowledge of human rights, and praxis for addressing problems in society. So quality education is beyond the writing, arithmetic, and reading. And that's important to recognize here. A little bit here more you saw on the bottom with global citizenship education. Like education for sustainable development, UNESCO's definition of global citizenship education has these domains of knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes, which can be seen as competencies. And I know you've been looking at competencies for education for sustainable development. So likewise, GCED, also human rights education, has these different domains, which of course lend themselves to the identification of competencies that we can then associate with national curriculum frameworks, with subject-specific curriculum, and with the lesson plans that we as educators develop for our own classrooms. And I wanted to share with you some breakout actually of these competencies of sorts, or let's put it this way, competencies / learning outcomes, which can be seen as associated with global citizenship in the minds of UNESCO. Because I understand this is an interest of yours with curriculum, so forth. So when I first engaged with UNESCO in global citizenship education, they actually asked me to do some curriculum analysis. There were several countries that were especially interested to review their national curriculum for the existence of global citizenship already, and to receive suggestions from UNESCO around how they could strengthen global citizenship education. And I was asked to do some reviews of country curriculum it was Kenya, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, let's see, Uganda, the Philippines, a few other countries. And in having to analyze the curriculum, we had to get quite specific about what it would actually look like. So I'm moving now from the general definitions of GCED to what it might look like in terms of themes, skills, and behaviors, because I think that's I like to see things more concrete. So here are some of the codes that I actually use. In terms of the knowledge areas, cognitive domain areas, global systems, structures, and processes, wherever they might be in the curriculum, that they learn about the United Nations, they learned about international financial institutions, maybe like the World Bank, they learn about other global systems that might be relevant for, say, Europe or for Spain, other places. Transnational corporations in the private sector, multinational corporations, global issues. I'm sure you've been thinking about these because of your focus on ESD. So again, global issues, these are other areas related to GCED, including globalization itself as a point of conversation. North-South relations, very prevalent now and very important when we think about the pandemic, access to vaccines and so forth. Climate change, global poverty, and other pressing issues like genocide, refugees. These are all related, could be seen as related to global citizenship education in the cognitive domain. And then attitudinally, you can see there's so much we have there also about orientations to others. We don't have to go further than our own schools to recognize how much wonderful diversity we have now. And that diversity is a resource for us. And it's also a challenge for schools to really embrace that diversity so that inside the curriculum, it's reflecting the cultures, the faces, the identities that are there in the school and in the societies at large in the country, but also outside. So attitudinally, there's a lot of importance to be placed for understanding identities and actually our multiple identities, because we all have one identity that's a composite of so many other ways that we see ourselves or others see us. Obviously, differences in respect for diversity, which reflects the cosmopolitan approach to global citizenship, and very important, intercultural empathy, dialogue, respect, concerns about discrimination and racism, not just topics, but things we also engage with emotionally, because especially when it comes to human rights, it's not just knowledge, it's really connecting up with our own vulnerabilities or other people's vulnerabilities, feeling a sense of solidarity, to work with others to improve situations in society. It's not just in the head, it's also in the heart, and the hands part, which is the behavioral here, we see with global citizenship education, engagement, participation, action. This is probably cross-cutting also with education for sustainable development. So I wanted to share with you some of these very, very specific indicators, if you will, of global citizenship education. I have some examples from Oxfam, which is a wonderful civil society organization working in global citizenship education for many, many years. I developed with some of my graduate school student teachers together as a team, we developed a resource for the IBE, which is one of the UNESCO organizations in Geneva. And I want to share with you Oxfam, and this was an annex that we included because I thought it was so good. But before I do that, I want to just take a break and see if you have any, before I share that, if you have any comments or questions about what I've shared so far. Go ahead, Edward.
Thank you. I was wondering, you've been dealing with the transformation of curriculums in many countries, and I remember one of our closest ones as reference was the Finnish one that was modified in 2014 and implemented in 2016. And what we've seen, the ones that we've been dealing with that here in Catalonia, is that whereas curriculums are changing in the narrative, are not properly changing in the implementation. What I mean is that precisely what you have been referring, and also what the Education for the SDG UNESCO report explains, the idea that beyond the cognitive learnings, it is needed to develop the socio-emotional and the behavioral ones. This is explaining the curriculums, but teachers are not being empowered or properly trained to develop new educational approaches. And I was wondering on whether, from your experience and also your capacity to see several implementations, this has been key on the success on having global citizenship education as properly implemented in the educational systems.
Edward, it's a very powerful point you make, and it's generally, I think, a weakness we can find in many of the approaches that are calling for transformative education, whether it's education for sustainable development, global citizenship education, peace education, human rights education. There's many times a gap in teachers' own education around how to address these issues, and it can be exacerbated, made worse, if the national curriculum frameworks are themselves not providing supports for teachers to move into these kinds of ways of teaching. UNESCO has been developing resources to try to sort of fill that gap by having exemplary lessons that can be potentially infused into different national systems of education. So UNESCO, as you probably know, on the one hand, their clientele are ministries of education, and they're trying to influence policies that are made at the top, right? So there you see, and I've seen more and more in national curriculum frameworks, language like the kind you referred to, language about education for sustainable development or global citizenship. So UNESCO is working at that level. But then as you go into the syllabi, you see less of it, or you see it more as a kind of just as a topic, just like you said. And in that way, what UNESCO's strategies are, as I understand it, is to provide resources of like lessons, practical lessons that teachers can voluntarily use themselves. It's a stopgap measure in a way, right? Because ideally it's coming through the system itself. But I have to say, at this moment in time, is thinking about global citizenship education, the resources I see teachers using, for the most part, are coming from outside the schooling system. They're coming, not always, but coming from UNESCO resources they have to adapt and localize, or coming from a local non-governmental organization that's very interested in cultural rights, for example, or really interested in fair trade and globalization and global citizenship. So I think that it unfortunately means that it requires teachers to be very proactively trying to find these resources. It requires a kind of, I call them activist teacher, not activists in the sense of like necessarily on the streets marching for climate justice, although perhaps all of you are, but unfortunately requiring that extra effort. So in this effort that UNESCO has been making recently with global citizenship education, and I'm referring to UNESCO since this is a kind of format for us, they've been working more intensively with certain countries to kind of have it thread through. One country that's doing a really strong job on bringing global citizenship education into all the curriculum with also action-oriented results, that's always a weakness, right? Is Kenya. For whatever reasons, Kenya has really embraced global citizenship education. They already had transversal competencies for citizenship, and they added to the citizenship competencies a global dimension and a human rights dimension. And then they have this beautiful matrix where they show how these citizenship, global citizenship, and human rights education topics, which include, by the way, education for sustainable development, can work at different school levels, at different subjects. And so they show how it can be infused in. And the idea is that as the subject competencies and syllabi get revised in the future, the curriculum writers themselves will use this matrix and then integrate moving forward. Because in the short run, it's like, okay, here's what we're looking for it's in the national curriculum framework, but then subject matter curriculum have their own cycles of revision, just like textbooks. So it's a whole systems process, which is very interesting. And at the same time, individual teachers are getting trainings and they're getting resources offered that they might be able to use that they think are relevant for them. So it has to be addressed very systematically with leadership and over time. And I hope that answers your question, but that's my observations. Yeah, and thank you. It was a great question, and it's relevant, I think, for many of the topics you're interested in. Maybe, does anyone else have a comment? Of course, feel free at any point. I'm going to share now. Let me see if I can find it. I wanted to share with you an example from Oxfam. I sure hope that I can find it here. I'm sorry, I've got so many windows open. I think that this is, nope, that's my Zoom link. That's not it. Okay, so let me get that. Let me see if I can let's see if I can find, I have a resource for you. Let's see, maybe this is it. Okay, I'll try this the long way, but let me just show you this. Okay, so this is from the resource pack. Are you able to see some text right now? Are you able to see it? Oh no, okay, so let me see this. Can you see this text? Are you seeing any text?
No, we are only seeing
Okay.
the folders.
I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to get there. I think does this work? Can you see text?
Yes.
Very good. So I just want to show you, because I understood from Marina, you're interested in, competencies and so forth. So this is an appendix that's part of a resource I recommend to you if you're interested in, it's basically a toolbox for teachers interested in ministries of education in global citizenship education. It's very active, it's action oriented, it's like workshops, it's activities. And this is the one I developed with my students, actually. And we have this example. So in terms of approaches like education for sustainable development, global citizenship education, also human rights education, even though you might argue that some subjects, like for example, you are STEM teachers in this meeting, and many of you have found a natural link with the environment through the natural sciences, and you're teaching the natural sciences and also mathematics. Similarly, global citizenship education often has a natural home inside of the social sciences, looking at history, looking at social studies, looking at sociology. But for approaches that we feel are so important, and because they also are carriers of values and praxis for taking action, the arguments from advocates for global citizenship education, just like ESD, is that it should be infused throughout different subjects, not just one or two. So here we have examples from Oxfam, for example, of how, and if you're interested, I'll share these with Marina afterwards, and she can circulate, she'll send this out to you by email, this resource. But for example, examples of how you can infuse into art and design. Look at here, using art to recognize different perspectives, ideas, beliefs, and values, basically interculturality through art. Obviously, if you have a civics or citizenship education course, there's a lot there for you to dig in terms of social justice and human rights, participation, power and governance, unequal power relations. So, and also there can be a global dimension brought in. I know I think we had a technology teacher in the room here today. So you can also talk about design and technology and its impact on the world, product design, supply chains, right? Sustainable development, and of course, English, media studies, drama, literature, of course, is ripe with potential avenues for inviting narratives and stories from people that are from cultures other than your own, for raising difficult issues, for discussion, for thinking about exploring our own ethics, asking students to write about that. Geography, history, I think you get the idea. We even have ICTs in computing. So Oxfam's points here are that if we are committed, we being our motivated educators like ourselves, or teacher trainers working in global citizenship education. I also teach global citizenship education to my student teachers, or in a ministry of education like Kenya, which is trying to promote global citizenship education across all different subjects. These are very specific ideas that we can bear in mind, right? And I think some of you, because we do have, I think, a mathematics teacher, computing and ICT, again, some creative ways of using science, analysis, data, to get at some of the topics that are worth discussing with our students around global citizenship, including poverty, real world problems, economics, trade, etc., identity, migration. So I think you get the idea. And again, I'll be sharing this resource which includes this appendix with Marina. So I wanted to give you an idea of how to think transversely about global citizenship education, and I expect that's also similar for ESD. And now what I wanted to do is move us into a conversation, and what I'd like us to do, just in an open discussion format, is to actually carry out a little bit of a conversation that I've actually carried out with teachers in training before, with whom I was working on the topic of global citizenship education. So I had presented, of course, I gave you already the definition of globalization, and I already today have given you 3 concepts of global citizenship. And I thank you for your attention to that. But there's another way of also trying to get at global citizenship education, which can defer talking about those definitions and just simply begin with teachers' life experiences. And so I want to return and emphasize that also as an important approach for you and for your students, because this is maybe something that you can do with your own students for global citizenship education. So you can, maybe those of you who read English have already seen it. I'd like to invite all of you to think about news articles that you've read recently that deal with either local or global challenges. But think about an issue that you really care about. And I'd like you to just either write in the chat box or take the microphone and share what you think or feel about the issue. What are your personal experiences related to this issue? Why does this issue mean so much to you personally? Because there's lots of news items you might select to discuss about. And then as we discuss, I'd really like us to process a bit. Are these local issues? Are they global issues? Where might we see a connection between the global and the local? So I'd like to invite us to have a conversation. Now, again, a news item, a recent one that you care about. Tell us why you care about it, whether you see it as a local or global issue, and let's see if we can find connections. Okay, so I'm going to turn off my mic and wait for you all to.
Si voleu, trenco jo el gel, perquè com que vinc atabalada amb totes aquestes declaracions del senyor Casado sobre lo terribles que són els docents a l'escola catalana, que no deixen ni anar a fer un pipí als nens que parlen en castellà, això ho ha dit exactament avui, aquesta tarda, el senyor Casado. Penso que aquest és un tema que està molt relacionat amb un aspecte local, que és, diguem, un conflicte que tenim aquí amb la nostra llengua, però que clarament connecta amb un repte global relacionat amb la democràcia, relacionat amb la vulneració de drets humans, amb el discurs d'odi, amb l'auge de posicions, diguem, extremistes i de posicions xenòfobes i de discriminació, diguem, de les minories, contra tota aquesta discussió que ara ens estava parlant la Felisa, que té a veure amb abraçar la diversitat, amb empatitzar o l'empatia intercultural, etc. Doncs contra tot això, aquestes declaracions del senyor Casado d'avui crec que tenen aquesta vessant de repte global que ens interpel·la a tots i a mi particularment, diguem, em ressonen molt negativament, amb emocions negatives, diguem, xungues, i que penso que és un dels exemples del que ens estava demanant la Felisa. més coses va, que n'hi ha moltes d'aquestes, malauradament.
Thank you, Marina. Please, someone else. Oriol.
Jo? Vale, d'acord. Jo, per de formació professional, que vinc del món de la geologia, un dels temes que més em preocupen, i els companys que hi ha per aquí ho saben, és el tema de la crisi energètica i de recursos. I en aquest sentit, l'encariment de l'energia elèctrica a Espanya, però també la manca de subministres d'alguns dels xips, per exemple, ara fa poc, o d'alguns subministres pels cotxes, jo la relaciono automàticament i per deformació amb la manca de minerals, amb la manca de petroli i tot aquest món. I això és una de les coses que em fan grinyolar fins i tot la terminologia que fem servir, perquè com per mi és important i és una cosa que he estudiat, el tema del peak oil i tal, quan parlem de desenvolupament, sostenible o no, jo em poso nerviós, perquè o és desenvolupament o és sostenible. Llavors, això, per apuntar una cosa que de vegades és local en termes de pobresa energètica, per exemple, la gent que no pot pagar la llum o que tanquen les fàbriques de cotxes o de la Nissan, però que ve a una cosa molt més global i de ciències naturals, que és d'on vinc jo, que és l'escassetat de recursos energètics, jo crec que connecta molt bé amb tot el que estem parlant.
Thank you. Felip.
Felip, the floor is yours.
Vale. Doncs jo parlaré de la vacuna, perquè ara hem de triar si vacunem els nens o no, i és una cosa que a tots els que són pares i mares ens impacta directament, i jo tenia molt clar vacunar-lo i de cop i volta m'arriba una allau d'informació en contra de la vacunació dels nens i les nenes i veig tota aquesta desinformació i tota aquesta pseudociència que es connecta amb la ciència i hi ha una cosa que em preocupa d'això de la justícia global, que una part intenta com recuperar els sabers tradicionals, però aquests sabers tradicionals també estan barrejats molt de pseudociència. I aleshores a mi em preocupa especialment que per intentar ser amables i intentar incorporar tots aquests sabers que s'han estat invisibilitzant, s'incorporin sabers que no ho són, sinó que senzillament ens estan colant aquesta por. I té a veure perquè aquí, per sort, a Espanya, més del 90% de la gent s'ha vacunat, però els infants no estan vacunats i ara les famílies que s'han vacunat per poder sortir a fer coses i fer el Nadal més tranquils i tal, resulta que estan tenint dubtes de si vacunar nens i nenes o no. Als instituts ens està passant també que els adolescents, els joves i les joves, doncs, alguns estan vacunats i alguns no estan vacunats i estan començant a caure els primers... Durant aquestes 2 o 3 setmanes portem molts positius i els positius precisament són de les persones que no s'han vacunat i clar, ens està com molt així. I ho relaciono també amb les notícies de que s'està com parlant de l'obligatorietat de la vacunació i no sé fins a quin punt això és com una imposició o com una necessitat global. I no sé què... Estic una miqueta que no sé què pensar, perquè potser estaria a favor de que, saps, de que s'imposés per estar tranquil, però entenc que no es pot imposar una cosa d'aquestes. Aleshores, aquí em posa molt nerviós aquest tema.
Thank you, Felip and Oriol and Marina for sharing. I really appreciate your stepping up and answering these questions. These are really obviously excellent examples and pressing issues for our day, whether it's the pushback against speaking Catalan in schools, the natural resource crisis, vaccines. These are all obviously pressing issues and on your minds. And I wanted to deconstruct this discussion with you because if you were to have this with your colleagues or even with your students, similarly, most likely you'd come up with issues like these, which you already clearly related to both local and global dimensions, right? the global being that it's a shared problem. For example, whether or not governments should require vaccinations or not. I mean, because your comment, Philippe, had so many elements of it that would be so interesting, right, to discuss. The government mandates, the problems of the pseudoscience, the role of science. There's so much there. So there's shared issues across countries and governments around things like the pandemic, but also in some cases there's an interdependent, same with hate speech and Marina's concerns around the way that othering can be emphasized when a group is denied is criticized for not speaking the dominant language in a country, right? So that's also a shared problem in other countries and environments as well. The natural resource crisis that Oriol mentioned, of course, is really one that's interdependent. I mean, you have very specific issues within communities, but it's absolutely a shared interdependent problem. So this is a way to begin a conversation about globalization and global citizenship with teachers and with students by having them first think about what issues they care about. And then after sharing some of this, begin to discuss some of the things I just started to mention, like what's shared, what's interdependent. And of course, I'm sure those of you who are educators, and maybe you all are, you can already imagine what could we do in the classroom? Well, we could set up a debate, right? We could set up a debate about vaccines, should they be mandated or not? We could ask students to do some research on fake news. We could organize a special class on hate speech and what it is looking like, and safety, digital literacy and digital safety, since so much of hate speech is happening digitally. So as an educator, you could take this information and move, I think, really nicely into some very productive activities with students. Anything else? Would someone like to share anything else before we move on, either about this activity or about an issue of concern for you? This particular activity, I know you're educators, but I'll still deconstruct it. Of course, I like this kind of very simple discussion before going into concepts, because you begin with people's or students' own values and issues they care about. So it locates it themselves in the moment, in the issue, and then you link up to local and global. And then and then you deepen engagement and issue, and then you move into the sort of what can we do about this, I guess. Okay, so let me then go back to my slides. Let's see. I had another, you could, just as a follow-up to this activity, I already mentioned that you as educators could obviously come up with very creative ways of allowing students in your class to engage on issues that you think is important for everyone to get further into. And that might include the so what can we do in our local community as well as our global community. And I'd like to share something here with you all, since you're interested in education for sustainable development. I did an online training for UNESCO. Actually, I developed a course on global citizenship education for UNESCO that we offered to primary school teachers in Africa. Very interesting. And it included education for sustainable development inside of global citizenship education. You know, sometimes you can mix and match. Sometimes ESD is the frame, and inside of that you find human rights and global citizenship. Other times ESD and global citizenship are siblings. It just all depends. But anyway, I was very curious to know how some of these African teachers, I asked them to develop a lesson. It was a course over a month. They had to develop a lesson that they felt would be really relevant for them, for their students and themselves. And many of them picked topics related to education for sustainable development. And what they addressed was very, very relevant for their communities. Some of them taught sustainable agriculture. And so that was the way that they linked up with ESD, was sustainable agricultural techniques. And others just talked about pollution. Others talked about energy conservation, but it was absolutely things that they could do in their classrooms and in their homes. And I guess I don't need to underline that too much with you, but one of the challenges as we think about these really pressing global problems is how to not create cynicism in students, right? Depress them about these conditions, always give them something that they can do actively then and there in regards to their own behaviors, their families' behaviors, educating others. So this is what I also learned that from these teachers, that it's very possible to do that. So some of the, as I wrap up my treatment of global citizenship education with you, I'd like to leave some thoughts with you, things that I have learned about teaching global citizenship education and teaching teachers about global citizenship education that I'd like to offer to you for your consideration. The first is always to remember to deconstruct concepts and also values. Don't assume that, whether it's climate justice or diversity, any of these things that might be familiar to us, to deconstruct them and try to really get underneath them and understand what's the meaning behind them, especially big ideas like global citizenship. Deconstruct them with learners and have them bring meaning to it for themselves and in discussion with the class. Obviously, linking with local value systems is also very, very important. This will have more meaning when we get into the conversation around human rights education, actually, which is just filled with values, right, that are codified in international human rights laws. But how does this relate to the value systems of, for example, local cultures or religious groups in the schools where you're teaching, in the country that you're living in? What's the connection there? And to see if there can be a kind of an interesting conversation, if you will, between the local value system and those proposed by more universal systems. I myself, although I'm a proponent of human rights education, I'm also a proponent of being critical of human rights and not accepting the human rights values as a given, as universal. I think in order for it to be meaningful, it has to be discussed, it has to be deconstructed, even challenged, right? Because human rights itself has been accused of having a colonial past. So we have to be willing to be critical also of human rights. And so not just looking for links between human rights and local value systems, but treating that as an opportunity for discussion. So keeping a critical perspective, right, towards globalization, global citizenship, and to come human rights education, and reminding students that local issues and local behaviors do have global parallels and consequences, and focusing on what you and your students care about, and of course taking action. So these are some of the big takeaways for me. It's about 5 minutes after the hour now. I did want to check in if everybody was okay for continuing, or if you wanted to take a short 2-minute break. Would people like to take a little bit of break and come back in a few minutes? Whatever you'd like. I know it's English for some of you, it might be a challenge. You're okay? Okay, good. Very happy to continue then. Then I have a question for you. I have an activity before we move into human rights education, because this is kind of the halfway mark. But I want to see if it's interesting for you, because if it's not, feels like it's not going to be that interesting, then I'll just move right into human rights education, where we can get into interesting conversations about pedagogy. The activity I had was for you to go on a Jamboard, which I've prepared, and to share different ways that you might measure or collect evidence for global citizenship education happening in different parts of the schooling system, like for teachers, for learners. It's not the same as student assessment, but it has to do with, actually, it kind of relates to what Edward asked earlier, like, well, how do we know? And I began to talk about ministries and then what happens in classrooms. would you be interested to try to brainstorm a little bit about how we would recognize that global citizenship education is happening in schools and classrooms and in policies, or not? If you're interested, could you put up your thumb? You know, if you can do your I don't know if you can show your emotions here. If there's one thumb, okay, 2 thumbs up, 3 thumbs up, 4, okay. Okay, I'll tell you what, if we start doing this and you end up bored, we'll shorten it, right? Because give me feedback. Okay, so thank you for the thumbs up. Then here we go back to this. So this is my attempt to bring in measurement, because I know that's part of the working group mandate. So I'm going to give you a link to the Jamboard. It has different pages, 5 pages. The big question is, how might we measure or collect evidence on the success of global citizenship education efforts undertaken by organizations like UNESCO, civil society organizations, and also local education actors, because there are many different actors interested in global citizenship education. How might we measure success? So with that, let me go to the, let me show you the Jamboard. Hold on just a second. Let me get the link for you, and then I will go to the Jamboard. Sorry, just give me a moment to navigate. Here we go. Here's the Jam. So I'm going to show you the Jamboard link. Okay, so here's the Jamboard link. You can just click on it. It should take you right there. And now I'm going to just very quickly go there and share with you what we have. So I have prepared different areas where we might see success. And my question is, what kind of evidence would we look for? So let me just go through the slides. I will show you. I don't know if you've all used the Jamboard before. Let me quickly show you how it works, just in case. Okay, so first of all, if you go to the top here, you see the cursors. This is how you can change pages. So here I'm asking you for evidence of learner outcome success. If you click, you go to page 2. What kinds of evidence might you see in classroom practices around global citizenship education? Click again, 3rd page. What about school-wide practices? What kind of evidence might we see for global citizenship education school-wide? Another area 4, what about teacher supports and teacher motivation? How might we recognize that there's success there? And finally, what about the big picture? Education sector policies. 6 is blank. I just have these 5. So I'd like you to brainstorm evidence for each of success in any of these domains or all of these domains, whatever you feel comfortable with. And here's how you make a note. If you take your cursor, you see there's a menu bar on the left. This looks like this is called sticky note, a Post-it. You click on it. You click on it, sorry. And this appears. You click on it and you get something called sticky note. You can change color if you want to. I like to change color. Then you type here. This is my example. You save it. And there you have it. And you can move it around. You cannot edit it after you've made it. You can make it smaller or larger. So again, for the sticky note, you click on it. You pick whatever color you want. Type in your text. Oops, sorry. And then you save it. And there you have it. Okay, and if you want to get rid of it, you just click on it and you. So I hope that that's clear. It's very simple. Sticky note. Please feel free to put sticky notes on as many of these areas as you would like. I'm going to give you let's say 10 minutes for this, okay?
10 minuts.
Are you still convinced you want to do this? Is this interesting for you all?
Esteu d'acord? Seguiu convençuts de que aquesta activitat us interessa o heu canviat d'opinió?
Okay.
Sí?
Otherwise, 5 minutes. Okay, we'll try 10 minutes.
Va, provem-ho amb 10 minuts. Vinga.
Disculpa,
Felisa.
Felisa, només volia afegir...
Sí, Mireia, endavant.
Un moment, faig una intervenció només per afegir que us sentiu còmodes d'escriure en català si ho preferiu, que no hi ha cap problema, que després farem una lectura en veu alta de totes les notes i així li podrem traduir a la Felisa.
Sí, Felisa.
Great. Thank you for saying that. Yes. 5 more minutes. Okay, just 1 more minute to see if there's anything else you would like to add. And if you've finished posting, have a look at what your colleagues have written. We won't have a chance to walk through all of these because of time, but there's really a lot, I can already tell, of terrific ideas here. So if you have finished writing, please feel free to enjoy what your colleagues have written, and then we'll do a little brief wrap up and then move on. I think we have a lot here. So thank you so much for engaging in this. I've noticed without being able to read most of what's here, that you as teachers had quite a bit to say in terms of learner outcomes, which is not surprising. And again, I think in the interest of time, we won't review all that you have, but I can see even with the language abilities that I have, that you cover a lot of it's not only content, it's also for learner outcomes, it's taking action, engagement, attitudes, agents for change. A lot of the themes that were evident here, were the rationale for our webinar today. So these are learner outcomes that you've identified. A challenge for you all would be what can be assessed or not assessed. I know when I teach curriculum and pedagogy, I make a distinction between formative assessment and summative assessment. Formative assessment means it might be that you are paying attention to how students are expressing themselves, if they're participating eagerly in the activities that you are organizing, if they're enthusiastic about the project work, if they want to do something in their community. So those kinds of signals to you may not be something that contributes to their grading, but that it helps you as an educator navigate and adapt your work in the classroom so that students are successful in the ways that you would like them to be. So another question that we won't answer now would be, okay, these learner outcomes are very diverse and they're also not all easy to assess. And you might even argue they should never be assessed, so to speak, never been given a grade. So what do we do then? So, I mean, we could get into pedagogy if you want to. I think in terms of participation and school projects, there is a lot that we actually can assess. Attitudes and values are more difficult. I think you don't want to assess those per se, but you do want to pay attention to how students are engaging. And if you have students with different points of view, of course, if you have problems like hate speech, then you need to address that directly in some way. But anyway, I think there's lots of really great ideas here. I'm not surprised you have so many. The second one was classroom practices. So again, here, I gather it has to do again with a climate of respect, a climate of participation, connection between I think the local realities and the global, if I'm getting this correctly. Certain kinds of methodologies are being used. Great, absolutely. The classroom pedagogy, full of really rich ideas here. So again, I wanted to do this exercise with you for you to, when you think about global citizenship education, because it's a new approach, just like education for sustainable development is a new approach. Social justice is calling us to think about values and thinking about actions. Some of these are not easily lending themselves to traditional forms of assessment. Some pieces can be assessed, other pieces not. But at the same time, if we are advocates for education for sustainable development or global citizenship education, we can see other kinds of evidence that it's happening. It's being implemented, it's being supported. So I wanted to expand our idea of evidence to think not only about learner assessments, but thinking about evidence that, it's taking hold in the classroom, it's being supported in the classroom, or in the school, or in teacher training. So I just wanted to expand a little bit your notion of measurement and assessment. School-wide practices here, we again see, I think, mutual respect, the language that's learned in schools. I'm not sure if I'm getting all this, project-based work, special infrastructures, relationships with families, alums, absolutely. There can be school-wide themes like on social justice, right? That's very common in the United States. And that overarching theme can be a rationale for having a transversal integration of global citizenship education, ESD, human rights education throughout all the subjects, and also in special days, right? Because you have December 10th was International Human Rights Day. So there's lots that you can do also school-wide that would help, especially around the cultural elements, I think, and practice-oriented elements of, in this case, GCED. Teacher supports and motivation. Obviously, this has to do back to initial teacher education, teacher training, a problem Edward mentioned earlier. You know, how can we support teachers? So what would be evidence that teachers are supported with global citizenship education? They have it in their initial training, or additional training is provided. That additional training, maybe it's provided by the ministry, by the education province. Maybe it's a non-governmental organization, a civil society organization that has a specialty, and the school brings them in to train teachers. That happens. It could be communities of practice. You all are part of a community of practice that's been organized to foster understanding of ESD and assessment and the competencies. There are other communities of practice, virtual, many of them, also on global citizenship education, on human rights education. And these can be organized by teachers themselves or by other organizations like those engaged in this particular webinar. So teacher supports also include resources, by the way, that they actually have teaching and learning materials that they can use or adapt for their own use. So I would also consider that to be an important resource for teachers. And finally, we have a few ideas about the education sector policies. Probably most importantly would be the curriculum that you've mentioned here, because the curriculum drives so much else. It drives resource development, it drives teacher education institutions, it drives assessments for students, and we have to pay attention to all these things. So, these are all places we look for evidence, and they're also places for action, obviously, places for action for global citizenship education. I hope that you found that to be a kind of useful activity in terms of thinking about measurement and a little differently than you have perhaps in the past. I hope so. If you're ready, then I'll switch us over to human rights education. Hope we're ready for that. Let me go from the current slide. Here we go. So I had some of these from my former students. Maybe it's interesting for you to see, but it's in English. So I think you had such interesting results, but I will slowly go through these slides. I'm not going to ask the interpreters to read them necessarily, but learner outcomes that have been mentioned by others, I have done this exercise with, include what you had: attitudes, awareness, taking action, even group-wide results. Classroom practices, yeah, experiential learning. I think you had project-based learning, but remember, for global citizenship education, you've got guest speakers, great lessons, use of ICTs, help field trips may be also very useful, school-wide practices, partnerships with families, civil society organizations, local government. Model United Nations is a terrific kind of activity that you can do to promote global citizenship education, and special days that I mentioned, like International Human Rights Day. The education sector policies, I focus a lot on policy, so it's curriculum, but it's also budgeting, it's leadership, it's teacher credentialing, and also the monitoring and evaluation of results. So it's not just something on paper, but something that schools and teachers will be accountable for. Okay, obviously the educator is key. Curriculum is a big driver from the policy side, but you educators are in the driver's seat when it comes to global citizenship education. Okay, so I want to move us back on the Jamboard. Now you know how to use the Jamboard. I'm going to shift us now into human rights and human rights education. I'd like to ask each of you, actually it's a Mentimeter poll, not a Jamboard. I'd like to ask you to answer the question, when you first learned about human rights. I have some options for you. You have to pick the one that's closest for you. when did you first learn about human rights? And let me take you to, let's see. Here we go. So again, it's Mentimeter. So you go to menti.com and you put in the code that you can see at the top of the screen. And the options I have for you are primary school, middle or secondary school, university, family or friends, or something else. Just take a minute. And if you never learned about human rights, then you can put other. I should have put that as an option. If you never learned about it, just put other. Not everybody has had it. Okay, just 10 more seconds. Okay, thanks. Well, look, this is interesting. So it seems that we have a bit of a diversity. We have middle or secondary school is the most popular, and close behind primary school. Family from university was only one of you learned about human rights for the first time in university. I have to share with you that I've been asking this question since I first began to do teacher trainings on human rights education in the 1990s. So that was really a long time ago. And in the 1990s, no one was learning about it in primary school or secondary school. Almost exclusively, it was university. At that time, human rights education was very much associated with learning law. So unless you were studying international human rights law, you might never learn about human rights. Perhaps you heard the phrase, but you didn't actually learn about it. So I have to say it's a very interesting development that I've observed across different countries, where now we have a much greater chance, I would say, of learning human rights before you leave basic education. Because if you imagine yourself in a country where only 6 years of education are required, what would then be the chances that you learn about human rights? And they might be somewhat minimal. So I wanted to recognize this diversity, but also to remind us that if we have any belief in the value of human rights in the international system, as a value system, for our students and ourselves and our daily interactions, as part of global systems, if we have any belief in that value, also as a mechanism for social justice and social change, it's absolutely an imperative that everyone knows something basic about human rights. And there was a period of time many years ago where, again, unless you went to university, you most likely didn't learn about human rights, which means it was very elitist and also very legally oriented. And one of the things that's changed in the last 20 years is the kind of popularization of human rights through education and training, as a kind of an initiative of sorts. And that's, for me, been a very, I've been very happy to see that. This was not Jamboard. Let me go on. So one of the things I want to ask you to think about also as educators, when you think about the first time you learned about human rights, and I don't mean that you heard about it, that you really learned about human rights, what was the nature of this learning experience? Was it in school? Was it in a club? Some of my students learned from Amnesty International. If it was informal, was it through your parents? friends, reading the news. Some of my students are descendants of people who survived the Holocaust, and it's a family history. They get very interested in human rights and genocide because of that. What was the nature of the experience? And what was the content focus? Were you looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the whole frame of civil, political, social, economic, cultural rights? Or was it children's rights or women's rights? And again, when you think back on your experience, was there a kind of participatory, experiential element to it? Was there an action-oriented aspect that you were supposed to put something into action around your learning of human rights? And finally, as you think back, would you consider that it was a good learning experience? Was it a good one? When you look back, you think, yeah, boy, I remember learning about human rights and it made me really motivated to learn more. Or I remember learning about human rights and I really felt I should do something about it. Because that would be the residue, right, of good human rights education. We're not going to share right now, but I wanted to ask you to think about this, because those of us working in human rights education care a lot about the quality of the experience. And just as we've already been in this webinar through Global Citizenship Education and you through ESD talking about what quality GCED, what quality ESD is about, it's about knowledge. It's about values and attitudes. It's absolutely about behavior and action. So there's no difference here, not at all. So let me carry on. And as with Global Citizenship Education, you can see human rights education integrated within different subjects. So I think I'm going to go ahead and share that with you lightly, because then we're going to move into, I think, a little bit what's human rights and pedagogy, which is really, really fun. So the Danish Institute for Human Rights, which is the National Human Rights Institute for Denmark, just published a resource, which I helped them with, actually, 3 of us wrote it together, on how to put human rights education into the national curriculum. And it was based on SDG 4.7 and the fact that there are, we hope, indicators that governments will be using to see if they're basically offering human rights in the national curriculum or not. And regardless of how much is being offered, this resource was intended to help give ideas about how human rights education might be integrated. And I want to give you an example that is not the typical example. It has to do with environmental education. I wanted to pick that one because, of course, of this audience. I just have to, let's see, here's the guidance note. Here we go. So now I want to hopefully share my screen and you can see this. And then we'll get into more fun stuff. But I know you're interested in competencies, so that's why I wanted to share this. So this is, I think you can see it. These are human rights education content areas and learning outcomes for the subject of environmental studies. And here we have, I'm sorry for all the English. I'll share this resource with you. It just came out like last week. It came out around International Human Rights Day. So yeah, it was last week. So we have here 2 main content areas, the environment and human rights, and we have, according to age level, learner outcomes or competencies, you might say, associated with these. For little kids, they can recall how a safe, clean, and healthy environment is linked to the children's right to health. We can go to older children, let's say upper secondary, again on the topic of the environment and human rights. They'll be able to describe the root causes of environmental crises and the human rights implications of these crises. So you see ESD linked up with the International Human Rights Framework. There's another content area, sustainable development and human rights. And here again, looking for links that can be made between sustainable development and human rights. If we go to lower secondary here, we get into also duty bearer behavior, that the learner will be able to tell how the human rights, what are the human rights obligations of governments related to sustainable development. Was what part of what human rights offers is this idea of duty bearers and rights holders, right? So there are other examples we have this in this resource. It's about 46 pages. We also have it for religion, for teaching history. But I did want to use the example for the sciences. And now what I'd like to do is do a little bit of a basics on what is human rights and human rights education, and then we get into pedagogy. I was suggested by Marina to do this because maybe not all of you sort of know about human rights, although it seems like most of you have had some of it. Maybe I should just double check on. Marina, do you think I could go through this quickly, not spend too much time on it? I don't know how much people want me. It's not a very long set of slides on human rights, but I don't want to repeat what might be well known by this group. What do you think?
Per mi és un privilegi comptar amb la teva definició de drets humans. Jo crec que sí que és interessant i sí que si et podem demanar que ho fem així sintèticament, però crec que sí que agrairem poder-la tenir. Felisa, merci.
Okay, and again, I can also share the slides if it goes too fast. All right, so what I say to my teachers is that the main aim of human rights is to ensure that the human dignity of each person is respected. That's really what it's about. And the international legal human rights standards basically codify what it means to experience human dignity. And if I think about the problems that were mentioned by you early in the webinar, it means being able to study in your mother tongue, in Catalan. That's part of your human dignity. And that relates to the right to culture. It means that you are not subject to hate speech, which relates to the right to personal security. It means you do have a freedom of expression, but you don't have the right to express things that incite violence or discrimination against a group. The natural resource crisis, we have, there are evolving human rights standards around that, right? The right to environment is an interesting question. We do recognize in the international human rights standards the right to clean water, the right to food, and many of those rights for basic needs are linked with a clean and healthy environment and a sustainable environment. So the natural resource crisis from a human-centric way relates to our ability to survive because it affects our health, our nutrition, and so forth. But as an aside, the human rights framework, which is an evolving one, is beginning to have human rights experts have discussions about what the right to environment might mean, and whether the environment itself can be treated as a sentient element. What about we can talk about biodiversity as a right, but whose right is that? I mean, do animals have rights? Do those animals going extinct because of climate change have rights? Can the environment be treated as an entity? You know, typically human rights are around individuals, humans, it goes to court, but there's many thinkers now saying, well, primates have a lot in common with humans, let's say, and the behaviors of humans are affecting the survival, not only of humans, other humans, but of all kinds of biodiversity. So maybe the environment has rights too. So it's interesting. So, but it's very person-centered, human-centered right now, the International Human Rights Framework. There are kind of two areas of human rights which I think are very relevant for you as educators. The first are the laws, the international human rights treaties that governments sign, ratify, and voluntarily commit themselves to uphold. like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and so forth. So these are actually treaties, just like peace treaties are treaties. These are human rights treaties that our governments can sign, ratify, and uphold. And in association with these treaties are standards that governments are supposed to be mindful of and align their own policies and practices around. This is the idea, right? It's not perfect at all, not a perfect world, that's the idea. But there's also these cross-cutting values, these human rights principles, which are equality and non-discrimination, participation and inclusion, and accountability, and the rule of law. These are in all the treaties, and these norms are the norms also that can be brought into the classroom. Whether you call them human rights norms or not, I mean, they weren't invented by human rights. Our human rights did not invent equality or non-discrimination. Human societies have had to grapple with justice since humans were living together. That's why we have laws. That's why we have religious codes. But in human rights, there was a coming together and an ongoing coming together of government representatives in conjunction with other stakeholders to try to agree on what this means in practice to the degree we can. So it's a validation of these common values. And in terms of accountability and rule of law, also a kind of agreement about good governance, essentially. Many people think that human rights and democracy are hand in hand. And I think that makes sense when we think about freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of protest. But there's also, of course, a spectrum of full democracy and limited democracy. My own home country has been slipping into limited democracy the last years, unfortunately. Another, I think, set of what I can call concepts to be, I think, aware of in the human rights world is the distinction between duty bearers and rights holders. So this vision of human rights, because it's utopia. And if you have already seen the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, which was passed by the General Assembly of the UN in 1948, so just a couple of years after the UN was founded. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was non-binding, but it laid out the rights that would then become eventually legally binding treaties. It was very aspirational. It's a beautiful document. I really recommend you look at the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if you haven't already. In any case, the whole UN system around human rights, also called human rights mechanisms, is around basically trying to induce governments to abide by their human rights commitments. Again, these are voluntary treaties they sign and ratify. Governments are considered the duty bearers vis-a-vis their treaties. And anybody who works for the government, by the way, is also considered a duty bearer. So if you are a teacher in a public school in Spain, guess what? You are a duty bearer. You are a duty bearer in terms of delivering the right to education to your students. But you are also a rights holder, meaning that rights holders are those who can claim their rights towards those responsible for helping them realize their rights. So you are a duty bearer vis-a-vis your delivery of the right to education, but on the other hand, you're a rights holder, being able to claim from your administrators, from your schooling system, the resources you need, the salaries you need to be able to do your job well. So it's a shared kind of responsibility. Duty bearers go all the way up from teachers, all the way up to the Ministry of Education, to parliamentarians, but you also have rights vis-a-vis your responsibilities to deliver the right to education. But this relationship between duty bearers and rights holders is very, very important. And this is kind of the virtuous relationship of human rights, that there are individuals representing the government in some way or paid by the government in some way, who must fulfill their responsibilities, their human rights responsibilities to rights holders. And rights holders in turn should know what their rights are so that they can claim them if they're not being met. So all around this, you can see where I'm getting to is education and training. Duty bearers need to understand what their human rights obligations are, and this can be shown through codes of conduct. It could be shown through national laws, consistent with international standards, and rights holders, of course, need to know their rights, and also laws that protect them or might even be missing in their country, so that they can claim their rights or push for new laws or whatever kinds of changes might be required. But education is key to all of this. In 2011, so now 10 years ago, the United Nations passed the Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training. And here you can see this rather lengthy definition, but I wanted to share it with you and unpack it, because it really carries a lot of meaning about human rights education. First of all, the UN recognizes that it's not just the schooling sector. Yes, it includes everything that happens in schools and the formal schooling sector, from pre-kindergarten all the way to university, but it also includes all training, including trainings of civil servants and police officers, awareness raising, lifelong learning. So it's basically any way that we're learning as children and adults. And the idea of to promote these values of human rights that I've mentioned already, equality, non-discrimination, and so far, and fundamental freedoms. You find this language in all over UN documents, promoting universal respect for and observance of all human rights and fundamental freedoms, but with a very specific agenda to prevent human rights violations and abuses. So this is a very, very specific agenda to human rights. It should have a residue in terms of individual behaviors or collective behaviors around reducing human rights violations and abuses. And of course, how human rights violations happen can be very complex processes, but just as a principle, this is what HRE is about. And it has the same domains we've talked about earlier in this webinar and others I'm sure you've had. There are dimensions of knowledge, skills and understanding, developing attitudes and behaviors, promoting and resulting into universal culture of human rights, right? So this is a tall order. In the Declaration, we do not see the language that there is a right to human rights education and training, because governments don't tend to want to acknowledge there's a right, because then they're accountable. But you can see that the language is really close. Everyone has the right to know, seek, and receive information about all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So it's really, really close. To be honest with you, we were very excited that it came out with such strong language. And I would like to mention that since human rights education and training has gotten increasing amounts of attention inside the UN, inside civil society organizations, also inside of national curriculum, since that has happened, what was I going to say? I think we have an expectation, and it's in 4.7. So I think there's an expectation more and more that at some point it will be actually acknowledged as a right, which is very exciting. This is the gold standard for human rights education. And I'd like to remind you to think about the first time you learned about human rights. I asked you that about 20 minutes ago. And I'd like you to consider whether you experienced what I would call the gold standard of human rights education. The gold standard of human rights education is that you are educated about human rights. That means you probably learned something about the United Nations, maybe the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that's often taught in schools, the norms and principles. There is a lot of content you can get around human rights, lots. But it's also important that you're educated in a way about human rights that reflects the culture of human rights, that it takes place in a learning environment where there's mutual respect, many of the features that you had on the Jamboard earlier, like what would be the evidence that global citizenship education is happening in the classroom? I think many of you mentioned things like values, values of respect and collaboration. And so the culture of the classroom, the learning environment, also the participatory pedagogy is very important. So it's not just teachers, didactically just sharing knowledge, that there's engagement, there's dialogue, that students are really involved in this process and are participating. Participation is a human rights value. And finally, that it results in something that will lead learners to care about human rights or something like it, right? Maybe they say, well, I'm not so sure about human rights, but I believe in social justice, or I believe in education for sustainable development. Carrying out actions that will basically improve our planet, that will do good for others. So maybe that's just a disposition that resides in the heart of a student until they're older and they get a chance that they can actually do something. Maybe you give them an opportunity to do a project where they can actually experience doing public education on that. It kind of it just depends. But I wanted to mention that this is all very, very important for human rights education. Now, we've come to the end of our 2 hours, so I want to be respectful of time. I have a little bit more to say about pedagogy, and I could take 10 more minutes, but I'm also happy to conclude here. I believe it's your evening. It may be that you want to have dinner at this point. I'm also happy to share that slide. So I'd like to get a kind of signal from you all, or Marina in particular, about whether you'd like to take a few more minutes or if we want to just wrap up here.
Això com vulgueu tots plegats. Som conscients que avui és un dia molt complicat a nivell del calendari escolar, a nivell de la situació, diguem, pandèmica que estem vivint, en particular en els nostres centres educatius, i per tant, permeteu-me que ho obri el que digueu vosaltres. Si us animeu a fer 10 minuts més, i si no, li demanarem també a la Felisa que ens pugui passar, fer aquest retorn, i potser podem establir un diàleg amb ella asíncron per correu, així si hi ha alguna cosa que ens interessi especialment, o, per què no, tornar-la a convidar en algun altre moment. Què us sembla? Veig que hi ha algú que ha de marxar. Jo, Felisa, el que faria és tancar aquí. T'agraeixo moltíssim que estiguis disposada a allargar la sessió, i ens encantaria, però és veritat que el context potser no és del tot favorable a un divendres que per nosaltres és al vespre ja. I per tant, si et sembla, tu mateixa tanca una mica.
No need to explain. Understood. Thank you for asserting what you need. I think that's perfectly fine. And Marina, the last set of slides, which is number 3, I sent you all 3. I think it's very self-explanatory, and it just introduces, just so you know, I think you'll be interested because it's almost my favorite part, the notion of participation with students and different kinds of methodologies of instruction that move us into action and activation. I think you could look at those slides on your own or in a group and just have an open discussion, and I invite you to do that. So thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today and taking some of your Friday evening. I know it's a very hectic time of year. So thank you so much. I wish you the best as you wrap up your teaching and your grading. Probably you also have to do grading. I know I need to. I wish you also a very pleasant break between your teaching semesters, I guess. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Moltes gràcies a tu, Felisa. Ens llegirem molt atentament aquesta última part. Crec que serà precisament la que en podrem també treure més suc per tota la feina que hem de desenvolupar al grup de treball, que ha d'estar molt orientada precisament a la pràctica educativa, i per tant de ben segur que ens serà molt útil, i si és el cas et farem retorn i ens agradarà molt poder-ho compartir amb tu. No sé si hi ha algú més que li vulgui acabar de dir alguna cosa o que vulgui compartir alguna cosa amb tothom, i si no tancaríem la sessió. Eduard, no sé si vols acabar de dir alguna cosa, o Marc.
Bueno, agrair-te molt la sessió, que crec que ens emportem moltíssimes idees i bueno, que ha estat un plaer escoltar-te i compartir aquesta estona, no només tancar amb un altre agraïment.
Gracias. Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. And I will send you those resources that I showed you, excerpts from. I'm sorry, they're in English. I think they're also probably in, well, one is in French, the UNESCO one, I think so. I'm sorry that, yeah, it's English though. Thank you all. Listen.
No passa res, no?
No pateixis, estem habituats a traduir els documents si és necessari, no hi ha cap problema. Moltes gràcies per compartir.
Ens seran molt útils, tant aquest que ens has mostrat, els resultats d'aprenentatge, com a l'experiència de Kènia. Crec que pot ser també superinteressant per nosaltres, a veure. I espero que mantinguem el contacte.
Great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I hope so too. Just write me. Marina has my email address. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Felisa. Bye. Adéu a tothom.
Bye.
Gràcies a vosaltres.
Adéu.